Hey, Jacob, I'm going to just try to work the problem out for you and see if that's helpful to you. Hopefully it will be. I've set it up here in Excel. In fact, I'm going to make it a little bigger so it's easier to see. And like I said, so I'll just work through it, and hopefully that will answer some of your questions. If not, we can try to set up a time to actually meet together. So it's all about kind of understanding the interrelationship between these numbers. So our basic interrelationship is that our sales revenue minus our variable costs gives us our contribution margin, which isn't showing on here. And then our contribution margin minus our fixed costs gives us our operating income. Our units sold is not really, we can't calculate that by anything other than if we know our contribution margin per unit and our contribution margin. And our contribution margin per unit would be our contribution margin divided by the number of units sold. And our contribution margin ratio is our sales revenue divided by our contribution, our contribution margin divided by our sales revenue. So I'm actually going to add a row in here, and call it contribution margin. Contribution margin. All right. So once I have that in place, I'm in pretty good shape to start the process. So I kind of have to start with what I know and then work toward finding these answers. So this first one, I don't know my variable costs, I don't know my fixed costs, and I don't know my contribution margin ratio. I do know my contribution margin per unit, and I know my units sold. So if I know that contribution margin divided by the number of units sold gives me my contribution margin per unit, then I also know that my contribution margin equals my units sold times my contribution margin per unit. So that gives me my contribution margin, and then that's kind of the key to unlocking the rest of these. So my sales revenue minus my variable costs gives me my contribution margin. So I could solve for my variable costs by saying this equals my sales revenue minus my contribution margin. That gives me my variable costs. My fixed costs, I know my contribution margin minus my fixed costs equals my operating income. So I could reformulate that algebraically and say fixed costs equal contribution margin minus operating income. And then my contribution margin ratio, I know, is my contribution margin divided by my sales revenue. So there's my first company. So let's move on to the down company. That was the up company. Now we have the down company. This one's a little harder, and I think that the interrelationship is even like a little less obvious. It took me a minute to figure out because you have to recast it algebraically in order to figure out sales revenue. So I know that my contribution margin ratio, which is a known number here, is my contribution margin divided by my sales revenue. But I don't know my contribution margin. But I do know that my sales revenue minus my variable costs is the same as contribution margin. So I know then that sales revenue minus variable cost, which is contribution margin, sales revenue minus variable cost, which is contribution margin, divided by sales revenue equals contribution margin ratio. So when I do that, I'm left with only one variable, which is sales revenue, and I can isolate that variable and figure out how to calculate sales revenue. So my sales revenue is equal to, algebraically, my variable costs divided by 1 minus my contribution margin ratio. If you use the Help Me Solve This, they actually will show you how that's, they don't do a very good job of showing, but they can show you that it's derived algebraically. So now I have my sales revenue of $625,000. So my contribution margin, let me highlight that. So that was A, or not A, but that was my first one for that. My contribution margin is equal to my sales revenue minus my variable costs. And then my contribution margin minus my fixed costs gives me my operating income. And then I have my operating income. I'm sorry, I have my units sold, and I have my contribution margin. So to find contribution margin per unit, I just take contribution margin divided by units sold. So that's the down company. The third company is the left company. This one's a little more straightforward, I feel like. So again, I have sales revenue and variable costs. So my contribution margin is just my sales revenue minus my variable costs. And then my operating income is my contribution margin minus my fixed costs. This one's a little harder. So I have my contribution margin per unit, and then I know what my contribution is. So my contribution margin divided by units sold would give me my contribution margin per unit. So if I recast that algebraically and I take my contribution margin divided by my contribution margin per unit, that should give me my number of units sold. And then my contribution margin ratio is my contribution margin divided by sales revenue. All right, the last one, the right company, I have to do the same thing I did over here on the down company to figure out my sales revenue, which again is to recast that algebraically and say, hey, this equals my variable cost divided by 1 minus my contribution margin ratio. Once I have that in place, I can calculate my contribution margin by saying sales revenue minus variable costs. Now I know my contribution margin, and I know my operating income. So I know that contribution margin minus fixed costs equals operating income. So if I recast that algebraically, I can also say contribution margin minus operating income. Whoops, did I do that right? I think I messed something up there. Hold on. So contribution margin minus fixed costs equals operating income. So I can also say then that contribution margin minus operating income is going to equal fixed costs. And then again, if I know my contribution margin per unit and I know my contribution margin, I know that if I took contribution margin and divided it by the units sold, that would give me my contribution margin per unit. So I can recast that algebraically and say my contribution margin divided by my contribution margin per unit is going to give me my units sold. And that's it. I hope that's valuable to you. At least with it's recorded, you could watch it a couple times or whatever if there's a part that's confusing. If you're looking at it and it's still not making sense, let's schedule a time to get together. I don't know if you're here on campus. If you are, I can meet with you face-to-face. If you're not, we can use Zoom or something like that so that we can meet online and talk about it. I hope you have a great day, and I hope this was valuable.